I must begin this sermon by giving thanks to the Reverend Susan Cole, for these are not only my thoughts, but her thoughts as well. When she was ill this week, I took my sermon writing time to her home, and while I made soup, she typed our sermon. So this is crafted together by two. The Gospel of Mark is one of my most favorite Gospels. I love that he is precise in his storytelling. I love that he often gets straight to the point and that he uses very simple language that is easy to understand. It is the gospel that I most often turn to when I am in need of hearing the good news. Scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel writer and that the writers of Matthew and Luke based their gospels on his. So he was the first, and they took his very best material and added their own stories and their own impressions to what originally was Mark's story. I love that Mark begins with Jesus' baptism, with that beginning to Jesus' ministry and where it first began. You may know that there is no story of Jesus' birth in the Gospel of Mark. There is no nativity or angels or wise men. We don't hear about his parents or his childhood. For the gospel writer Mark, he begins with Jesus' baptism. It often makes me wonder if we then don't spend enough time on Jesus' baptism, for we give Christmas 12 days and his baptism only one. But that perhaps is another sermon for another day. The two things that stand out for me in today's story is that the disciples were just ordinary folks, ordinary people like you who came to fish with Keegan today, just ordinary people who responded to God, who responded to Jesus when he said, "Come with me," immediately. So ordinary people follow Jesus because he said, "Together we can do extraordinary things. Will you come and follow me?" he said. And they did. In the gospel story today, we hear about ordinary fishermen doing something extraordinary. After John was arrested, Jesus went to Galilee preaching the message of God, saying, "Time's up. God's kingdom is here. Change your life. Believe in the message and the good news." And there he was, walking along the beach on the Lake Galilee. I imagine that the sun was shining and the heat was warming his face, and that he felt that breeze that we all know that comes off the lake on a warm summer day. I hope the sunlight was dancing on the waves of the water. And there he saw them fishing. Simon and his brother Andrew were net fishing. They worked hard. They weren't like other wealthy fishermen. They couldn't afford a boat or cruise or large industrial nets. This was not modern-day line fishing. This wasn't a rod and a pole and a comfy chair where we often fall asleep and wake up to that fish on our line. This was hard work. This was intensive net fishing. The kind of fishing that requires you to focus, to be persistent and determined like Keegan was to get every last one of those fish this day. Jesus said to them, "Come with me, and I'll make you a new kind of fisherman. No longer will you fish for bass and perch, but you will fish for people." And they didn't ask questions. They dropped their nets and they followed. They didn't ask questions. They just dropped their nets and left immediately. And they didn't say, "Let me go home and check with my parents," or pack a bag. There wasn't a bon voyage party for any of them. They didn't say, like we often do in churches, "Let's form a committee and talk about it first. Let's have a meeting," or a meeting about a meeting, to then have another meeting. They didn't. They just dropped their nets and they left. And then a dozen or so yards down the beach, Jesus saw the brothers James and John, who were Zebedee's sons. They were in a boat. They were a bit well off, and they were mending their fishing nets. And there they were, and Jesus said to them, "Come with me, and I'll make you a new kind of fishermen." And immediately, they left their father Zebedee. Imagine as the father, when both of your sons hop out of the boat and leave you. Because Jesus said, "Come and follow me." And so they went immediately. Maybe they were ready. Maybe they had had a conversation with Jesus over the weeks that were prior to this incident. We don't have those details in the Gospel of Mark. And we won't really know, and it doesn't particularly matter. But what does matter is that they were ready and willing and able to go in hopes that they too might do extraordinary things. Extraordinary for me today that I might hear a story of water. In Zambia? Yes, in Zambia. I had the incredible pleasure in the month of October to travel with some of the folks at Jordan Station to a tiny community in the Dominican Republic. We were on our own water mission. We had raised about $1,600 to finish up a water project when my friend from Hope International said, "We need your help." And so we did. We raised a small amount of money. And then we went to the Dominican to see what other projects we might help to fund. And so after a 2.5-hour trek up into the mountains on a road that wasn't really a road, we ended up in a place called El Rosalito. And it's home to about 500 people. And they do not have access to water. So the women and children in their community walk a half a day in order to get water for their community while their men are out in the fields farming. Imagine walking for half a day to get water. And it's dirty water at that. It comes from a spring, but it's not clean. And so they do the best that they can. And so we asked questions of the leaders about how is it that you don't have water? Or on the classroom walls where we were meeting, because an aid organization thought what they needed was a school. And it's lovely, the school. No one goes there because the children have to carry water. But they do have a community space in which they can meet. And along the walls are the plans for the aqueducts that they need to bring water to all of these communities. There's even a list of the tools that are required for the men to dig it. And so we asked, well, if you've got the plans, why isn't there water? Well, because the Dominican Republic government came to do the plans and talk about it. And in the end, they decided that for 500 people, the cost of $180,000 was not worth it. And so they went without water. And they had heard through their agency community with Hope International that we were coming to town, sort of Canadian folk, and maybe they would help. And so we found ourselves sort of sitting in this space wondering, how on earth could our small little group help with this project? For $180,000 would be the largest project that Hope International ever undertook. And so there was this moment of incredible prayer where the leaders were praying in Spanish. My Spanish is un poquito, a very small amount, and so I didn't get very much, except that in prayer you feel it, right? Even if you don't know the words, you can feel the enthusiasm for it. And after it, one of the 91-year-old men that was traveling with us, Dr. Ken, he stood up and he said, "I'll give $10,000. And someone else stood up and said, "I'll give $10,000. And the mission development officer said, "We'll find some money. I can't find 180, but we can find some." And the folks from Jordan Station did what folks do, and we went like this. And I said, "We'll give money." Not really committing, because we hadn't had a meeting and we didn't really know how much money we could raise. And so before long, there was enough for them to get started. It has been almost 3 months since we had that meeting, and they will begin to dig next week. They have already raised $100,000, and we too will continue to raise money. And I tell you this story not so that you should give money to water necessarily, but that for me it was an example of dropping our nets. Dropping our nets and just going because we were called. Because we were called to follow. Because we didn't stop to ask questions or have a meeting or figure out whether it was doable. It was a moment where we just had faith that God would provide. Because sometimes I think we don't allow the space for God to work. We're so busy trying to figure it all out, coming from a place of fear, that we don't dream big. Well, good for that community. It's going to raise $10,000 for that community project in Zambia. I'm sure that they are terrified, because that's a big number. We committed to 20, which is twice as terrifying. But we know that God will provide. God will bring that money. But first, you have to drop your net. Whatever your net is. Maybe it's your fear. Maybe it's anxiety. Maybe it's just a feeling like, I don't have enough, so how could I provide for others? I'm here to tell you, God will provide. But you have to drop your net. You have to just be able to say, I'm all in, and it's go time. Because it is go time, right? Jesus, when he was choosing his disciples, didn't say, let's figure this out. He said, it's time to go, and we're going to go right now. It's go time. So it's go time. It's go time for St. John Stephen's Home. Whatever it is that you have been wanting to do, dying to start, thinking that if only, it's go time. Drop your nets and go for it. Look at this incredible, beautiful group of people. Together you can do amazing things. Together, 4 of you, when you put your hand up to say, I fish, and didn't realize that meant you had to come forward, were pretty scary, right? Like, uh-oh, she's going to make me come forward? That was fun, right? Was it fun? It was fun, right? And we expect our children to do that every single week, right? We call them up and we say, let the little children come to me. But we don't go. So good on all of you for dropping your nets and your fear and coming forward. Because that's all it takes. So drop your nets, because it's go time. Thanks be to God. Amen.